Hi, thank you so much to the organizers and everyone for being here. My paper is called Ice, Seeds, and Memory, Anarchival Art on the Arctic Island of Svalbard. My research is based on the Arctic island of Svalbard, 650 miles from the North Pole, as far north as humans live. I first went there in 2014 on an artist residency aboard a triple-masted tall ship called the Lady Antigua. With no known indigenous population, Svalbard has long been construed as a terra nullius, a no man's land, and a res communis, a thing for all. Its earliest settlers were Dutch, English, Danish, and French, hunters vying for whales and walrus starting in the 1600s. They were followed by mining prospectors, Arctic explorers, and trappers. With a population now just under 2,000, it remains a largely transient home to coal miners still, scientists, researchers, a growing population of Thai and Filipino workers. Adventure guides lead a surge of international tourists who come to immerse in the wild, watching for polar bears and calving glaciers before they vanish amid escalating climate crises. Glaciers in Svalbard are surging faster than anywhere else in the world. And yet, despite its environmental precarity, Svalbard has become the chosen location for a nascent industry of global memory storage. In popular media, Svalbard is most known for the Global Seed Vault, also nicknamed the Doomsday Vault. Oh, I'm sorry, there we go. This is the Global Seed Vault. Founded 15 years ago, the Global Seed Vault is the world's largest repository of seeds. Tunneled deep into a mountain at the back of a decommissioned mine shaft, the vault stores over 57 million seeds, deposited by 223 countries. Through cryopreservation, these seeds are said to stay viable for up to 10,000 years. The vault is designed to provide agricultural backups. I know that's the next word. Agricultural backups in the event of environmental and political catastrophes. The word Holocaust is invoked often, botanical and nuclear holocausts forewarned. 5 years ago, the Arctic World Archive was established. It refers to itself as a custodian of world memory. Unlike the Global Seed Vault, the AWA is for-profit, charging a monthly membership fee to store digitized copies of cultural heritage on a patented technology allegedly able to preserve the data for up to 1,000 years. It contains, for example, copies of the National Archives of Mexico and Brazil, the contents of private art collections, even NFTs. My dissertation asks what it might look like in these times of apocalyptic anxieties to archive differently at the end of the world. I suggest that the security and relief these global archiving endeavors promise sustains a fossil-fueled status quo. What is a blank slide? Yes. Thank you. Thanks so much. The security and relief that these global archiving endeavors promises, it sustains a fossil-fueled status quo, and that cryopreservation allows us to freeze our present petrocapitalist conditions. I ask, how can a renewed relationship to archiving thaw these conditions? I look to contemporary art, visual culture, and poetry, as well as my own creative writing practice, to grapple with these questions. My hope is to complicate and contest entrenched neo-imperial and ecologically consequential imaginaries of the Arctic, and Svalbard in particular, as a place that's egalitarian, everlasting, frozen, pure, and white. Whiteness as evidenced in endless vistas of snow and ice, as well as a historical and geopolitical erasure of colonial subjects like South Asian laborers, on whose backs British imperial expeditions to the Arctic were funded, and now the Southeast Asian workers that help keep Svalbard's local economy running. Due to its international status, the island is also considered geopolitically neutral, and thus the safest place to store the world's most precious memories. I take the following as my prompt. Catherine Yusof writes, The archive is a metaphor for the organized processes of memory and forgetting that we institute into our structures of knowledge and knowing places. We can imagine that if we change the demands of the archive and the archivable, we might get some very different artifacts and objects of knowledge. What knowledge becomes useful to us in a time of disorienting, abrupt climatic change? How can we creatively practice towards such uncertainty? I find the notion of the anarchival helpful here. In his 2004 essay, An Archival Impulse, Hal Foster discusses a growing trend among contemporary artists engaging with the archive who, rather than reinforcing ideas of absolute origins and stable conditions, instead gesture towards unfulfilled beginnings, obscure traces, thereby reconfiguring history and memory. Foster offhandedly refers to such work as anarchival. Scholars Alyssa Adami and Alessandra Farini take this concept further, stating that the anarchive is a set of forces and practices possessing destructive, subversive, and regenerative possibilities. In considering Yusuf's provocation, I'm particularly interested in recent work by Himali Singh Soin, British Indian visual artist and poet. She refers to her ongoing series of works, We Are Opposite Like That, as a fictional ice archive. It's inspired by her time in Svalbard and Antarctica. And so today I want to look at several poems from her artist book, where she foregrounds what might normally constitute the stuff of history's tangents, and instead extends them as lifelines. They are alternative suggestions for what we need to know and remember as we approach the end. In a poem entitled Footnote, our eye is drawn to where the footnote traditionally lives, set lower on the page, subordinate. These excesses, the little intimacies, become the feature narrative, an intentional handful of loose threads. Another poem blooms such a footnote to life, giving voice to the young clairvoyant girl from Calcutta, called upon by British imperial administrators to locate the missing ship of John Franklin's North Pole expedition. We are continuously led back to and away from the Arctic in a transit suggestive of global circulations of commodities, labor, and fantasy. In an untitled poem, we see an empty vertical frame, like a picture frame. Its outline is composed of the tiny dots and dashes of Morse code. The code recalls histories of emergency, war, and crisis, and we can insert ourselves into that frame. We can look straight ahead into the void of it. But we can also connect the dots of our own apathy. In our inability to translate the code, we are presented with what we technically could learn, but that which we're not bothered to. An erasure poem is a poetic form of sacrifice. It discards to preserve. It makes meaning through absence. As a reader, in not knowing what we are missing, we apprehend the erratic shape of loss. In the context of the Arctic and the landscape of capitalist violence, in which Soin writes in several works, white space reads like forgetting, dissolution, obliteration. What remains are blue words floating like broken pieces of sea ice, melting across the heat of the page. Her polar recipe instructs one in how to cook kofta, a traditional Middle Eastern and South Asian dish in Arctic conditions. When cooking on a camp stove atop a glacier, she suggests laying down a few extra sweaters so that the heat can cook the meat through. I enter the recipe's title bar kofta into Google Translate, and the translation from Hindi reads, snowflakes. When entering kofta alone, Google detects Norwegian, the word for cardigan. The cold is paradoxically conjured through the flexibility of language and the juxtaposition of flavors distant from the typical imaginary of Svalbard. For the purposes of anarchiving Svalbard, I mean enacting and following a sprawling network of creative destruction, of unspooling and peeling back away from Svalbard in order to reveal and reconceive it beyond its use as arc and allegory. I'm going to end with an erasure poem that I composed. One of the things I'm trying to work out is how to incorporate my own creative practice into my dissertation. And so I look forward to thinking together perhaps about how the visual and textual may work to subvert a certain way of imagining place, and to consider how anarchiving might alter the processes of knowing, collecting, preserving, dismantling, mourning, and orienting ourselves and each other in this time of disorienting climate crisis. The archive is located on the island. Haul open the huge steel door. You are living away from everything. You are afraid of the day today. The loud whirring noise of the future, its floor-to-ceiling potential, a crop yield lost. Flee to slumber, to come full circle. War, typhoon, flood, fire, and yet Vatican Library, Brazilian soccer, Rembrandt, Monk, crypto. In the case of global disaster, people wouldn't be forced to begin anew. They could withstand the mistakes we've made, our feats in code. Lying in wild is like water and air, the basis of everything. Barricaded in the room, the siege waged on. The seeds refused to protect the future. Thank you.